It was the early morning hours of Monday, July 30th, 2012, when something went terribly wrong in northern India. At first, it seemed like a regular outage, the kind people were sadly used to. Power cuts were nothing new in the country. Millions of people didn't have reliable electricity to begin with. But this time, it wasn't just a neighborhood or a single state going dark. This time, the lights went out for hundreds of millions of people all at once. Around 2:30 in the morning, the northern grid, the massive system that supplied electricity to much of northern India, collapsed. What caused it? A perfect storm of bad timing, overworked lines, and poor communication. Some transmission lines had already been taken offline for scheduled maintenance. On top of that, the monsoon season was placing heavy stress on the remaining lines. At the center of it all was a single transmission route, the 400 kilovolt Bina-Gwalior line, which had become the main lifeline between the northern and western grids. That line was only meant to carry about 700 megawatts of power efficiently, but at the time of failure, it was carrying more than twice that, over 1,400 megawatts. The load was too much. The circuit breakers tripped, and once that line went down, the grid couldn't handle the imbalance. Power that had been flowing from the western region to the northern grid had nowhere to go. The system panicked. The frequency dropped, and in just minutes, the entire northern grid shut down like a switch had been flipped. The blackout spread fast. Over 300 million people were without power, about 1/4 of India's population. Everything stopped. Trains halted on the tracks, traffic lights blinked off, pumps that supplied water to homes and farms shut down, hospitals switched to backup generators, businesses couldn't open their doors, and in cities like Delhi, people woke up confused and frustrated, not knowing the full scale of what had happened yet. India's northern grid had collapsed once before, in January of 2001, but this time the impact was even larger. This blackout wasn't just a failure of technology, it was a warning sign that the entire system was dangerously fragile. But the worst part? This was just the beginning. By the following day, Tuesday, July 31st, 2012, India's power crisis had grown into something far worse. Just as the country was struggling to recover from the massive blackout in the north, another failure struck. This time, it wasn't just one grid that went down, it was three. At around 1 p.m., the northern grid collapsed again, but this time it pulled down the eastern and northeastern grids with it. The chain reaction was immediate and brutal. More than half of the country was now without power. From Punjab in the northwest to West Bengal in the east, the outage stretched across 20 states and union territories. Over 600 million people were affected, nearly half of India's total population. It became the largest blackout in world history. The cause wasn't a mystery. Experts had already warned that the grids were being pushed too hard. Many states were overdrawing power, taking more electricity than they were supposed to, from the shared national system. Despite warnings from the central authority, these states continued to ignore safe limits. As a result, the grid was always teetering on the edge of collapse. The second failure started much like the first. When demand outstripped supply, key transmission lines tripped. Once again, the system's frequency dropped rapidly. This time, the stress wasn't limited to the north. The eastern and northeastern grids, which had been helping supply extra power, were also overwhelmed. Within minutes, the blackout spread like a wave. Unlike the earlier outage that happened in the dead of night, this second collapse struck in the middle of a workday. Millions of workers were suddenly stranded. Over 300 trains came to a stop, trapping thousands of passengers in sweltering heat. In Delhi, traffic snarled into chaos as signal lights blinked out again. Across rural areas where diesel generators were rare, farmers watched helplessly as irrigation pumps stopped working during the peak of the growing season. Coal production was hit hard too. Mines in eastern India had to suspend operations and evacuate workers from underground tunnels for safety. Airports switched to emergency power, metro systems ground to a halt, and communication towers across vast regions began running out of backup fuel. The mood in the country shifted quickly. What had first seemed like a technical glitch now looked like a national emergency. Questions flooded in from all sides. Who was responsible? Why weren't there safeguards in place? And most urgently, could it happen again? While much of India sat in the dark on the afternoon of Tuesday, July 31st, 2012, a race was underway behind the scenes. Engineers, technicians, and officials worked frantically in control rooms across the country, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to bring the grid back online without triggering another collapse. The first priority was to stabilize the northern grid, which had now failed twice in less than 24 hours. But the challenge was enormous. In India, each regional power grid connects to others through what are known as interconnectors, critical lines that help transfer electricity between zones. When one region overloads or fails, the effects can spill into others unless isolated quickly. This time, the domino effect had already taken place. Experts from the Power System Operation Corporation and the National Load Dispatch Center started isolating damaged sections of the grid, blocking off lines that had caused the overload. They then began the slow, delicate task of restarting what is known as a black start, rebooting power generation without an existing electrical supply to work with. This process relied heavily on hydroelectric plants, which could be started more easily than coal-fired stations. Meanwhile, across many cities and rural towns, backup systems kicked in. Hospitals activated emergency generators to keep life support equipment running. Airport control towers switched to battery power. In places where diesel fuel was in short supply, resourceful workers rationed electricity, powering only the most essential equipment. One major concern was water. In cities like Delhi and Jaipur, the electric pumps used to supply water to homes and apartments had stopped working. Thousands of residents had no running water for drinking, cooking, or washing. Some climbed down to ground-level tanks and carried buckets back upstairs by hand. Telecommunication networks also came under pressure. Mobile towers depend on electricity to transmit signals, and although most had some backup power, not all could run for extended periods. Calls dropped. Internet access slowed or disappeared completely. In some regions, local radio stations were the only available source of news and updates. While politicians gave statements promising swift action and accountability, much of the real work was being done quietly by teams of engineers. Many had not slept in over a day. They coordinated by phone and radio, manually adjusting circuits and voltage levels to prevent further failures. Each restored line was tested, monitored, and connected slowly to avoid another shock to the fragile system. By late evening, power had been partially restored in parts of Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal. Still, large portions of the country remained in the dark. Though the immediate danger was being contained, the grid remained dangerously unstable. One more mistake could have triggered a third and possibly even larger outage. The blackout had revealed something deeper. The energy system of one of the world's largest nations was under tremendous strain, stretched far beyond what it had been designed to handle. As power slowly returned to India's cities and villages, energy officials began a deeper investigation into what had triggered the massive breakdown. By Wednesday, August 1st, 2012, it had become clear that this was not the result of a single failure, but a chain of problems that had been building for years. At the center of the crisis was an overloaded power grid. India's electricity demand had been steadily increasing, driven by population growth, rising industrial activity, and a push for economic development. Yet the country's energy infrastructure had not kept pace. Power lines, substations, and transformers in many regions were aging and poorly maintained. Some parts of the system were operating dangerously close to their maximum capacity even under normal conditions. One of the most critical issues was the practice of overdraw. Several states, including Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and Punjab, had reportedly been drawing more electricity than they were officially allocated. This created an imbalance in the national grid. Instead of raising alarms and enforcing penalties, regulators had often looked the other way, partly due to political pressure and partly because there were no clear consequences in place. Adding to the strain was the seasonal nature of electricity demand. July marked the height of India's summer monsoon season. While the rains brought relief from the heat, they also reduced solar generation and sometimes caused hydroelectric output to fluctuate. At the same time, farmers relied heavily on electric pumps for irrigation. These pumps were often unregulated and switched on simultaneously, placing an enormous and unpredictable load on the system. Another weakness exposed by the blackout was the lack of real-time communication between regional grids. Each zone, north, east, northeast, west, and south, was responsible for its own stability. But when trouble started in the northern grid on July 30th, warnings were not passed fast enough to the others. As a result, the eastern and northeastern grids were caught off guard the next day, leading to a much wider failure. India's dependence on coal-fired power plants also played a role. These plants were already underperforming due to low coal supplies and outdated equipment. When the blackout struck, many of them could not restart quickly. Their slow recovery meant that other sources like hydro and gas had to pick up the slack, placing more pressure on limited resources. Despite growing investments in renewable energy, The country's grid still lacked modern features like automated load balancing, smart monitoring, and digital fault detection. These tools could have helped detect the warning signs earlier and possibly prevented the cascade. In the aftermath, officials pointed fingers in multiple directions, at state governments for overdrawing, at regulators for failing to enforce limits, and at outdated infrastructure for not being able to handle the load, but the truth was more complex. The blackout was not caused by a single bad decision. It was the result of a system that had been neglected, stretched, and patched together for too long without proper oversight. The events of those 2 days served as a painful lesson, showing just how fragile a modern nation's power supply can be when growth outpaces planning and when accountability is replaced with avoidance. In the days and weeks following India's massive blackout, efforts shifted from restoring power to understanding what needed to change to prevent another disaster of this scale. For millions of Indians, the outage was more than an inconvenience. It was a wake-up call that exposed the weaknesses of a growing nation. Caught between rapid development and aging infrastructure, the Indian government ordered a full investigation, committees were formed, engineers were interviewed, and reports were drafted. Among the key recommendations was the urgent need to upgrade the national power grid with modern technology. This included real-time data systems, better communication between regional zones, stricter control over how much electricity states could draw, and penalties for violations that would actually be enforced. There was also growing pressure to increase investment in energy generation itself. India's dependence on coal had long caused problems, from fuel shortages to environmental concerns. After the blackout, attention turned more seriously toward diversifying power sources. Solar and wind energy projects received a boost, and hydroelectric stations were evaluated for reliability and expansion. In a significant policy shift, India's Power Grid Corporation began work on integrating a nationwide smart grid. This would allow operators to track electricity flows more accurately and respond to issues before they became catastrophic. It would also help balance loads across the country by shifting power from surplus areas to those in need in real time. International observers took note. The blackout became a case study in energy conferences around the world. Engineers, policymakers, and disaster planners used it as an example of what happens when demand outpaces infrastructure and when enforcement of grid regulations is overlooked. Countries with rapidly growing populations and developing power systems, including those in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, took particular interest in India's experience. In India itself, the blackout changed how citizens thought about electricity. In the past, frequent power cuts were accepted as part of daily life, but after July 30th and 31st of 2012, the sheer scale of the failure forced a cultural shift. Businesses invested in backup generators, hospitals upgraded emergency systems, households began to conserve energy more carefully, and discussions around sustainable power entered public conversation in a way they never had before. The blackout didn't just knock out power, it highlighted a deeper issue. It showed that development without planning and growth without investment in maintenance could carry enormous risks. India's economy had been expanding rapidly, but its power grid had not kept up. The event brought energy planning to the forefront of national priorities and forced leaders to face uncomfortable truths. While power was restored within the days, rebuilding trust in the system took far longer, but the crisis served a purpose. It forced action, not just promises. It marked the moment when India began to take a long, hard look at its energy future and started building a system strong enough to support its ambitions. It was a cold Tuesday evening on November 9th, 1965, and the northeastern part of North America was running full speed ahead. Families were heating their homes, streetlights were flickering on as night crept in, and kitchens buzzed with the usual dinner time rush. But behind all of this, everyday life was a power grid stretched nearly to its limit, and no one knew that one tiny flaw in the system was about to bring everything crashing down. At exactly 5:16 p.m., something strange happened near the border between Ontario and New York. A protective relay, a kind of safety switch built into a transmission line, was triggered at the Sir Adam Beck Hydroelectric Power Station No. 2, not far from Niagara Falls. That one piece of equipment had been misprogrammed. It wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it was told to do, just not in the right situation. The system had been designed to shut down if it sensed something going wrong deeper within Ontario Hydro's massive network. And on that chilly November night, the demand for power was spiking higher than usual. The lines were working hard, maybe harder than they should have been. What happened next was like a domino effect on steroids. The relay tripped. One transmission line shut down. That forced all the power it had been carrying to surge into the other lines nearby. But they couldn't handle it either, and one by one they overloaded and shut themselves off too. This instantly cut off the Sir Adam Beck station from southern Ontario. Suddenly that whole region lost its main source of power. Now, with nowhere else for the electricity to go, the excess load was pushed east into New York State, but the grid there wasn't built to handle it either. Power lines began tripping in New York as well. Overwhelmed by the rush of redirected energy, the pressure built fast. In just minutes, the electrical system throughout the Northeast fell into chaos. Power stations were going dark. The grid was breaking apart into isolated pockets, each one trying to survive on its own. Some places managed for a few minutes, others collapsed right away. By 5:17 p.m., only 60 seconds after that first relay tripped, the blackout had officially begun. Whole regions, parts of Ontario, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and more were thrown into darkness. Over 30 million people were affected. It wasn't just a flicker, this was the kind of failure that made everything stop. Subways froze, elevators stalled, radio stations started to slow down. Even the music on the airwaves began sounding off pitch because the electricity running the machines wasn't stable anymore. Nobody expected a single setting on a single piece of equipment to bring down the lights in more than 10 states and part of a Canadian province. That's exactly what happened, and within minutes, engineers across the Northeast were scrambling to figure out how something so small had caused something so big. As the lights blinked out across the Northeast, confusion set in instantly. In New York City, rush hour was in full swing. Thousands of commuters had just packed onto subway cars when the trains ground to a halt deep below the city streets. Within moments, the entire subway system stopped operating, leaving nearly 800,000 people stranded underground. Emergency lights flickered on in some cars, others went completely dark. Above-ground intersections quickly turned chaotic. With traffic signals dead, cars jammed the streets, pedestrians were left to direct traffic with flashlights and hand gestures, while police scrambled to manage major roadways without any electronic assistance. In just a few minutes, New York, a city that never sleeps, felt frozen in place. But the blackout wasn't just hitting New York. In Boston, thousands of people had to make their way home on foot. Streetcars and trolleys shut down mid-route, leaving entire neighborhoods eerily quiet. In parts of Ontario, the sudden loss of power created a different kind of concern. Temperatures were falling, and without electricity, homes and buildings with electric heating grew cold fast. Emergency centers began filling with people seeking warmth and light. Airports were forced to close almost immediately. With radar systems offline and no runway lights, planes were diverted or grounded. Over 30 commercial flights had to be rerouted within the first hour. Passengers sat waiting in terminals lit only by candles and battery-powered lanterns. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers tried to manage communications by phone, struggling to stay in contact with pilots flying blind above the region. Hospitals switched to backup generators, but the load was heavy, and not every system made the transition smoothly. In some places, patients were manually ventilated by nurses using hand pumps. Surgeries in progress were paused or performed under dim lighting. In one New Jersey hospital, the emergency room had to be cleared because their power systems failed completely. There was no warning. People didn't have time to prepare. Food spoiled in refrigerators. Water pressure dropped in apartment buildings. Radios, which many people relied on for news, began to fade in and out as transmission towers lost power or failed to switch over to emergency supply. For many, the blackout wasn't just a loss of electricity, it felt like a total breakdown of normal life. Yet in all this darkness, something unexpected began to happen. Strangers helped each other. Store owners handed out flashlights and batteries without charging. People opened their homes to neighbors who had no heat. Even as modern systems failed, human connection began to take over. And while millions tried to adapt to the silence and the dark, utility companies were just beginning to understand what they were really dealing with. A massive, unexpected failure, still spreading in ways no one could predict. As power grids across the Northeast collapsed, engineers and technicians were left scrambling in the dark, both literally and figuratively. In control rooms from Pennsylvania to Quebec, blinking consoles offered little insight. Most believed at first that a single line or transformer had failed, But as hours passed, it became clear that the issue was something far more complex. What baffled experts the most was the scale. Entire regions, connected through vast networks of transmission lines, had gone silent almost all at once. The first suspicions leaned toward human error. Was a technician somewhere responsible for triggering this massive chain reaction? Others considered sabotage, a fear not uncommon during the Cold War. Military officials monitored radar systems closely, watching for signs of an attack, even though no direct evidence pointed in that direction. Still, the suddenness of the outage had a kind of surgical precision that left many uneasy. Meanwhile, workers in Ontario Hydro's control center began narrowing their search. They noticed a strange drop in power flow near the Sir Adam Beck power station in Queenston. This station, one of the largest in Canada at the time, fed power into key transmission lines that crossed into the United States. Just before the blackout spread, there had been an unexpected surge of electricity rerouted back into the Canadian grid. This was not normal. As engineers followed the trail, they landed on a crucial piece of equipment, a single transmission line near Ontario's border with New York. On that line sat a protective device, a relay designed to cut off power if the system was overloaded. It was supposed to act like a safety valve, shutting off flow to prevent damage. But something had gone wrong. The relay had tripped, not because of a massive overload, but due to a miscalibrated setting. It reacted to a perfectly normal flow of electricity as if it were a threat, and disconnected the line. That small break caused nearby lines to take on extra load, which then triggered their own safety shutoffs. The collapse began moving outward, like falling dominoes. What no one realized until that night was just how tightly interconnected the Northeastern power grid had become. A problem in one small section didn't stay local. It quickly rippled across multiple states and provinces. Within minutes, the grid's entire balance fell apart. Still, even with the suspected cause in view, restoring power wasn't simple. Technicians had to carefully restart sections one at a time. Too much load added too quickly could cause another failure. It took careful coordination between companies across international borders to begin bringing the lights back. Throughout the night, the investigation deepened. Utility officials, engineers, and government leaders began to ask hard questions. How could a single faulty relay plunge over 30 million people into darkness? And if it could happen once, could it happen again? By the early hours of the next morning, the massive blackout was slowly being reversed. Electricity returned to sections of Manhattan just before dawn. In Boston, streetlights flickered on after more than 10 hours of complete darkness. Toronto and other Canadian cities saw power restored in phases as crews worked through the night with extraordinary caution. Once the worst had passed, attention shifted to public reaction, and it was not what many had feared. Despite the panic that could have erupted in such a large-scale outage, the public response was, by most accounts, remarkably calm. In New York City, thousands of people were trapped in subway cars, but most waited patiently until help arrived. Others helped direct traffic at intersections when signals went dark. In hospitals, staff worked by flashlight and candlelight to continue caring for patients. Emergency services were tested but not overwhelmed. Some looting did occur, but it was isolated. In fact, many officials noted that crime actually dropped during the blackout. The general mood, once the shock faded, turned reflective. Newspapers and radio broadcasts praised the way communities had pulled together during the crisis. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson quickly took notice. He ordered the Federal Power Commission to conduct a full investigation, not just into the technical cause of the blackout, but into the design of the entire power grid. Questions were raised in Congress about how such a vast system had no built-in safeguards to prevent a single failure from spreading. Utility companies, now under heavy scrutiny, began to rethink how they monitored and controlled electricity across state and national borders. It was clear that the grid had outgrown its original structure. The rapid post-war expansion of cities and industries had pushed the system to new limits, but the planning had not kept pace. One of the biggest revelations of the post-blackout analysis was the lack of coordination between regional utilities. Each company had its own control center, its own procedures, and its own priorities. While they were physically connected through power lines, their decision-making remained disconnected. In short, the system had grown large without becoming truly unified. In response, a series of reforms began to take shape. Discussions emerged around creating shared regional oversight and better emergency response protocols. Within months, plans were proposed for more sophisticated monitoring equipment and real-time communication between utility providers. Although the blackout lasted less than one full day, its impact on infrastructure policy was long-lasting. It exposed the fragility of systems that millions depended on daily, and it brought energy planning into the spotlight like never before. The Northeast Blackout of 1965 was not just a momentary power outage, it was a wake-up call that changed the way electrical systems were viewed and managed. In the aftermath, investigators, utility companies, and government officials worked together to understand what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. The main lesson learned was the importance of system coordination. While the grid had been interconnected to share power more efficiently, it had not been managed as a single unit. That lack of coordination allowed a single failure in Ontario to ripple through multiple states. After the blackout, both American and Canadian utilities began building more structured communication systems between regional operators. Engineers began designing new kinds of protective relays and circuit breakers. These devices would better respond to sudden shifts in voltage or frequency and isolate a problem before it could spread. Control rooms were upgraded with real-time monitoring systems, giving operators more information about what was happening across the grid at any given moment. The event also led to the creation of new institutions. In the United States, the electric industry formed the North American Electric Reliability Council in the late 1960s. Its mission was to develop standards, train operators, and ensure that different regions of the continent could work together to avoid large-scale outages. The council eventually evolved into what is now the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, still active today. On a broader level, the blackout changed how people thought about infrastructure. It showed that even the most modern systems could fail. Cities and states began to include electrical failures in emergency planning. Hospitals invested in better backup power. Schools and businesses reviewed their procedures for dealing with long outages. For the public, the blackout remained a shared memory for decades. People who lived through it often described the night as both eerie and peaceful. There was a little panic, and in many places, neighbors helped one another. It became a story passed down through generations. A reminder of how one moment of failure could bring millions to a stop and how quickly life could change without warning. Though power was restored within a day, the shadow of that night lasted much longer. It reshaped the future of electricity in North America, and it proved that preparation, cooperation, and smart design were not just technical goals, they were essential to daily life. On the morning of January 23, 2023, Pakistan experienced what would turn out to be one of the largest blackouts in modern history. Around 7:34 a.m., the national grid collapsed. All across the country, from the southern tip of Sindh to the mountains in the north, everything went dark. Over 220 million people were suddenly living without electricity. The power didn't flicker. It disappeared completely. In Islamabad and Rawalpindi, power came back after about 8 hours. But other cities weren't as lucky. Karachi and Lahore stayed dark for around 16 hours. And for rural areas, it was worse. Some places were without electricity for an entire day, others for 2 or even 3 full days. 72 straight hours with no power, no fans during the hot day, no heaters through the chilly night, and no working water pumps. People were stuck, and not just in homes, schools, hospitals, banks, even entire industries were paralyzed. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. There had been a big blackout in 2021, then another one in southern Pakistan in October 2022. But this time it hit everyone. This was the second largest power outage ever recorded anywhere in the world. And unlike smaller disruptions, this blackout stretched across cities and towns, homes and hospitals, marketplaces and government buildings. The cause? At first, no one knew. Officials said something about a frequency drop, maybe a voltage spike in the southern part of the country, but that didn't explain how the entire grid collapsed like dominoes falling. The deeper story, it turned out, was much more troubling. What looked like a sudden event was really the result of a long, slow breakdown. Years of underinvestment, poor planning, and a fragile energy system finally falling apart. But in those first few hours, as cities stood silent and millions of people sat in the dark, no one was thinking about infrastructure or energy policy. They were just trying to make it through. Parents searched for candles, shopkeepers waited outside darkened stores, and children looked up at ceiling fans that wouldn't spin. Hospitals scrambled to keep patients alive. And across the country, people asked the same thing: how could this happen? What they didn't know yet was that this blackout wasn't just a one-time disaster, it was a warning. a glimpse of just how close everything was to falling apart. And in the coming hours and days, the full impact would unfold, bringing the country's weak points into sharp focus. As the hours passed, what had begun as a strange inconvenience quickly turned to a national emergency. Pakistan's largest cities, normally full of life and noise, came to a standstill. Karachi, a city of over 20 million people, had its streets choked with traffic, where signals had stopped working. In Lahore, businesses shut their doors while customers waited outside, confused and frustrated. Cell phone towers failed, internet services dropped, and communication between people and even authorities became nearly impossible. Hospitals were hit especially hard. Generators kicked in where they were available, but fuel supplies were limited. In some hospitals, life-saving equipment had to be rationed. Emergency surgeries were delayed. Staff worked in dimly lit rooms, relying on flashlights and battery-powered devices. Patients in intensive care units, dependent on ventilators or dialysis machines, were suddenly at risk. In smaller clinics and rural hospitals, backup power didn't exist at all. Water, often taken for granted, became a major problem. Electric pumps stopped working, leaving entire neighborhoods without clean running water. In homes and apartment buildings, taps went dry. People walked for blocks in search of bottled water or working hand pumps. In areas where winter temperatures were low, the lack of electric heaters added another layer of misery, especially for children and the elderly. The manufacturing sector, already struggling from economic pressure, took a major hit. Factories across Punjab and Sindh shut down entirely. Textile mills, one of the country's largest exporters, stopped operations. In some cases, workers were sent home for days. Cold storage facilities lost temperature control, risking millions of rupees worth of food and medicine. Small businesses with no access to generators closed shop, losing vital income in an already strained economy. Banks could not process transactions. ATMs were down. Point-of-sale machines stopped working in stores. In parts of the country, even fuel stations could not operate, leaving people stranded without the ability to travel. Urban infrastructure that depended on automation, such as metro rail systems and toll plazas, went offline. City governments were left scrambling to manage traffic by hand, redirect resources, and calm growing public concern. For many citizens, the blackout wasn't just about lights being off, it was about being cut off from the rest of the world. With phones dying and internet access gone, families couldn't check on loved ones, offices couldn't contact employees, businesses couldn't reach suppliers or clients. It was a breakdown of trust in a system people had come to rely on, even if it was flawed. Still, many tried to adapt. In neighborhoods, people lit candles and gathered in groups to share food and updates. Some radio stations remained on air using emergency generators, becoming the only source of information for millions. Social media, accessed briefly by those with backup power or mobile data, became flooded with confusion, complaints, and questions no one could yet answer. And as night fell across the country, the darkness became even more unsettling. What was usually a glittering view of city lights from rooftops or highways had turned pitch black. Only a few scattered buildings glowed, hotels or offices with powerful private generators. The rest of the country sat under a dark sky, quiet and uncertain. In that moment, Pakistan was not just experiencing a power outage. It was witnessing what happens when an entire infrastructure collapses all at once. How closely daily life depends on systems that, when broken, bring everything to a halt. While citizens across Pakistan were struggling through the chaos, behind the scenes, engineers and officials were working to trace the origin of the massive failure. The country's fragile power grid had experienced blackouts before, some lasting hours, others stretching into days, but this one was different. It affected nearly every province at the same time. Something had triggered a nationwide failure, and the government needed answers fast. The Ministry of Energy soon confirmed that the blackout was not caused by a terrorist attack or foreign cyber intrusion, though those fears had initially surfaced online. Instead, the cause was internal, rooted in the country's outdated and mismanaged power infrastructure. Officials pointed to a voltage fluctuation that occurred during maintenance work on the southern transmission lines. That fluctuation rapidly spread, tripping multiple power plants across the country in a domino effect. Pakistan's power grid is a delicate network, divided into regions, but connected enough that a disturbance in one part can ripple through others if not managed quickly. At the center of the issue was the synchronization between the north and south transmission systems. These two sections must be carefully balanced, but during routine maintenance early in the morning, A technician's action unintentionally caused a surge that the system couldn't contain. Within seconds, major power plants in Sindh and Balochistan disconnected automatically to prevent damage. The failure moved northward. Hydroelectric plants, coal stations, and gas-fired units all began to shut down as a safety measure. What made this failure worse was that Pakistan operates with a very narrow margin between electricity demand and production. On a typical day, the grid is already under stress. When large stations suddenly go offline, there is little backup power to stabilize the system. Instead of localized blackouts, the entire country plunged into darkness because the system lacked the automation and advanced controls needed to isolate and contain the disturbance. In technical terms, the grid had collapsed. That means the generation fell below the level needed to maintain frequency, a measure of electrical balance across the network. When that happens, the grid must be restarted almost from zero, a difficult and time-consuming task in any country, but especially in one where equipment is outdated and manually operated. Pakistan's aging infrastructure was part of the reason the collapse was so complete. Many power stations are more than 30 years old. Some still rely on analog controls. In wealthier nations, software and remote sensors allow grids to respond in milliseconds. But in Pakistan, operators often have to rely on manual processes, delayed data, and a lack of coordination between regional power centers. Another problem was the shortage of black start capacity. These are special power stations that can restart the grid without relying on external electricity. Pakistan has very few of these, and even fewer that are kept in working order. When the blackout occurred, restarting the grid required physical inspection and gradual reconnection, plant by plant, city by city. Despite the overwhelming scale of the crisis, some engineers remained at their stations for over 24 hours without rest. In freezing temperatures and with little communication between sites, they began the slow work of bringing the system back online. First, the power plants had to stabilize their generators. Then transmission lines had to be tested for faults. Only after that could electricity be sent to urban centers. The technical cause was now clear. A poorly managed voltage change in one region had pushed the entire system beyond its limits. But beneath that was a deeper truth. The blackout was a warning. A signal that the country's aging energy system, already strained by underinvestment and rising demand, was not equipped to withstand even a minor misstep. As sunrise lit up the cities and villages of Pakistan on that January morning, millions of people awoke still without power. The blackout had lasted through the night, leaving families to sleep without heaters and food vendors to open their stalls without refrigeration or electricity. But in control rooms and power stations across the country, engineers had worked through the darkness, restarting generation units and testing connections one section at a time. Restoring power to an entire nation is not as simple as flipping a switch. The process, known as a grid restoration or system recovery, must be done in stages. After the frequency collapse, generation units had to be brought online one by one. Load balancing, the act of matching power supply with demand, became a difficult puzzle, especially in regions with unpredictable energy needs. Some of the first areas to regain electricity were parts of Islamabad and Lahore. These cities had higher priority grids connected to key government institutions and military facilities. Power was gradually restored to essential infrastructure like hospitals, water treatment plants, and airports, but rural areas and smaller towns were left in the dark for much longer. By the afternoon of January 24th, limited power had returned to most major cities, but even then it was not consistent. Voltage fluctuations continued, lights would come on for an hour and go out again. In Karachi, some districts had partial electricity by midday, while others remained without power until the next morning. People began lining up at gas stations again, not for fuel, but to charge mobile phones and refill cooking gas canisters. Pakistan's telecommunications sector, already stretched thin, now had to deal with damaged networks and overloaded systems. Some mobile towers had been running on backup batteries for nearly a full day. Once those batteries died, entire areas lost cellular service. Landlines were mostly unusable. Internet service providers, especially in smaller towns, were unable to restart operations until electricity was fully restored. Economic losses were mounting by the hour. Markets stayed closed and industrial zones remained silent. Textile factories in Faisalabad, many of which operate on tight export deadlines, reported missing an entire production day. Small businesses, particularly those without generators, suffered the most. In a country where many people live hand to mouth, Even a single missed day of work could mean going hungry. Water shortages began to emerge in cities like Rawalpindi and Peshawar. Water pumping stations require continuous electricity, and with no power, reserves began to run out. Municipal workers had to set up emergency delivery systems using trucks, but those could only reach a limited number of neighborhoods. In several areas, people walked miles to collect water from open wells or streams, unsure of its safety. The blackout also raised questions about emergency preparedness. Few hospitals had functioning generators for extended use. Schools closed for an extra day in multiple provinces due to unsafe conditions and lack of communication. Some areas had no working traffic signals for over 24 hours, leading to dangerous intersections and multiple road accidents. By the end of the second day, power had been restored to most of the country, but full stability would take longer. The grid remained vulnerable. Officials warned citizens of potential rolling blackouts in the following days as engineers continued to monitor the network and carry out inspections. Across Pakistan, frustration mixed with fear. This was not the first blackout, but it was by far the largest in recent memory. People demanded answers, accountability, and assurances that such a disaster would not happen again. The physical power may have returned, but trust in the system had been severely shaken. In the weeks that followed the massive blackout of January 23rd, the government of Pakistan launched a formal investigation to determine exactly what had gone wrong. The Ministry of Energy held press conferences and issued updates, but clear answers were slow to come. Officials pointed to a voltage drop that triggered a shutdown, but the underlying causes ran deeper than just a sudden frequency collapse. Investigators from the National Transmission and Dispatch Company began piecing together a complex picture. Their early findings suggested that maintenance protocols had been overlooked and that several key power stations had failed to respond correctly when the voltage levels dropped. In simple terms, the safety systems that should have isolated the problem and contained it did not function as expected. Further scrutiny revealed weaknesses in the grid's design, including the lack of regional isolation zones. In many modern systems, a failure in one area can be cut off to prevent it from cascading. But in Pakistan's case, the interconnected grid meant that once one segment collapsed, the rest followed like falling dominoes. Energy experts warned that unless the infrastructure was upgraded and monitoring technology improved, similar incidents could occur again. There were also calls for accountability. Lawmakers questioned whether power station operators had been properly trained and whether budget cuts had led to the neglect of crucial upgrades. In Parliament, opposition leaders demanded an independent audit, arguing that Pakistan's energy security was too important to leave in the hands of bureaucracy alone. Meanwhile, citizens tried to move on from what had been one of the most disruptive blackouts in the country's history. For millions, it had not just been about darkness, but about the loss of dignity in daily life. Elderly people had gone without medical equipment, children had been left cold during winter nights, families had missed meals because electric stoves and gas pumps were useless, trust in public services had taken a serious hit. In the aftermath, there was renewed interest in off-grid solutions. Some households turned to solar panels, even on a small scale, as a form of insurance against future outages. Businesses began investing in higher capacity backup systems. But for the poor who could barely afford basic electricity to begin with, there were few options. International observers also weighed in. Energy experts from neighboring countries and global organizations offered technical support and analysis. Several reports compared Pakistan's crisis to similar blackouts that had affected large countries in the past, noting that poor grid maintenance and centralized systems were common risk factors. The lessons were clear: without modernization, the risk of collapse would always be present. By February, stability had returned, but the memory of that dark January night still lingered. Social media continued to carry stories from across the country. Images of candlelit classrooms, makeshift emergency rooms, and frustrated workers trying to continue life in the absence of light. These personal accounts served as reminders of how vulnerable life had become in the absence of reliable infrastructure. The Great Blackout of January 23, 2023 was more than a power failure. It was a national reckoning. It revealed the cracks in a fragile system, exposed the limits of outdated technology, and reminded millions of what happens when progress outpaces planning. As Pakistan moves forward, the true challenge will not be just keeping the lights on, but ensuring that the entire country is never left in the dark again.